Coming back to that town felt like peeling away a scab I'd picked in my whole life. The streets were narrower than I remembered, the houses closer together, their faces sagging with age and secrets. Everything smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet earth. Nothing had really changed, and that was the worst part. I had grown up pretending the chapel was just another building, just another crumbling relic standing hunched at the edge of town like an old man who'd seen too much. But even as a kid, I'd felt the unease coiling in my gut every time we passed it. Adults lowered their voices near it. Children crossed the street without even realizing they were doing it. It loomed over all of us, casting a shadow long after the sun had gone. Nobody talked about the last service in anything louder than a whisper. They said Father Holloway stood at the pulpit one Sunday morning, his voice sharp and full of something no sermon should carry. The pews had been packed. Good people, families who knew each other their whole lives, who had built this town with their own hands. When it was over, if you could call it over, those who went in to see what happened said the congregation had been altered. Some bent backward so sharply their spines split the skin. Some still kneeling, their hands fused together in prayer, their faces blank, eyeless. Some simply missing, as if erased. The officials had said little. Structural collapse, they mumbled. Gas leak, they speculated. Nobody believed it, but everyone agreed on one thing. The chapel was cursed, and so it stayed sealed, its doors barred, its windows dark. And yet here I was. Maybe it was guilt for leaving. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was some thin thread of memory pulling me back to that place. Something from those nights when I dreamed of the chapel with its doors breathing open and shut. Whatever it was, it dragged my feet down the muddy path leading to it, my heart battering my ribs with every step. The lock was old, rusted to paper thinness. It crumbled when I touched it, as if the chapel had been waiting for me. The doors groaned inward on their own, whispering something low and ugly. Dusk bled across the sky, staining everything in bruised colors. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Sharp, metallic, alive. Inside, the chapel was untouched. I stood there in the doorway, swallowing dryly. No blood slicking the floor, no bodies rotting in the pews. The air was thick and humid, curling into my throat with a sickly sweetness. Dust motes spun lazily in the dying light filtering through the stained glass, painting the aisle in broken rainbows. The pulpit was still there. The pews were perfectly aligned, like soldiers awaiting a command. The hymn books sat neatly stacked, their covers undisturbed by time. It looked like a service could start at any moment, as if Father Holloway would shuffle out from the shadows, wipe his spectacles, and begin. Except for the smell. It wasn't just metallic. It had weight, intent, the way a predator's breath feels on the back of your neck before it strikes. I moved cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust. Yet wherever I walked, the dust shifted oddly, almost rippling around my boots, like something unseen had stirred it before me. The pews stared at me, hollow and expectant. I realized in that terrible moment that the building wasn't empty. It was waiting. The urge to flee pressed down on my shoulders, but my feet dragged me forward, past the rows of empty seats, past the heavy silence that seemed to thrum with a heartbeat not my own, toward the pulpit, where a thick, leather-bound Bible rested atop a wooden stand worn smooth by years of trembling hands. Beside it, a sheet of parchment lay curled, its edges brown with age, yet the ink was startlingly fresh. My fingers hovered over it, trembling. A sermon, written in jagged, frantic lines, sprawled across the page. I didn't read it, not yet. I was too busy staring at the handwriting itself, which seemed to twist and writhe on the paper if I looked too long. The sharp stink grew worse here, almost unbearable. It seemed to cling to the pulpit like mist. I saw tiny droplets along the wood, glistening in the dim light, but when I leaned closer, they weren't water. They were red, thick and slow-moving, like sap from a bleeding tree. The hair on the back of my neck rose. Behind me, the heavy double doors of the chapel began to creak. A slow, shuddering groan, like ancient lungs drawing breath. I turned, every nerve screaming. The doors swung shut with a thunderous slam that shook the pews. The chapel smelled thicker now. Copper or mold, something sour underneath it, like meat long left to rot in hidden corners. I stood rooted to the spot, back against the locked doors, heart hammering so hard it seemed to rattle the stained glass windows. But nothing came. No footsteps. No breathing. Just the suffocating hum of something waiting. The pulpit called to me. The Bible lay open, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Dust clung to its surface, but the parchment beside it, the one bearing Father Holloway's final sermon, seemed untouched by time. It was almost obscene how new it looked against the decay around it, like something freshly written in a house long dead. Drawn forward against every instinct screaming inside me, I approached the pulpit. Each step was heavier than the last. My boots sank slightly into the warped wooden floor, a softness beneath them I refused to dwell on. The parchment shivered faintly, though there was no draft. I leaned over it, close enough now to read. At first, the sermon carried the familiar cadence of Scripture. Words about grace and salvation, the tired refrains of 100 Sundays past. Father Holloway had always been a man of strict ritual, a man whose voice had once been the thread binding this fraying town together. But as my eyes dragged down the page, the words began to stutter. Phrases broke apart, repeated themselves. Latin phrases interwoven with English. Then something else, symbols I didn't recognize, twisting shapes that made my vision swim. The handwriting degraded line by line, growing more jagged, the letters slanting sharply upward as though being dragged by a frantic, unseen hand. It spoke of a second mass, one unlike any before. It warned of those who waited beneath, not beneath the chapel, not beneath the ground, but beneath the skin of the world itself. It named no names, but every word was thick with terrible reverence, a feverish awe for whatever congregation was gathering unseen. The final lines were almost unreadable, scratches more than letters, as though Father Holloway had written them with shaking, bloodied fingers. And now the second mass begins. The ink bled into the parchment in strange, spidery veins. I stared at it too long, my mind snagging on the sharp points of the letters, caught as if on thorns. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, something wet and urgent, like my own blood was trying to rearrange itself in answer to the words. I forced myself to look away, gulping stale air that stank of iron. Without thinking, driven by some foolish, desperate need for proof that I still controlled my own body, I reached out and lifted the parchment. It was lighter than it should have been, thinner, almost alive under my fingertips. The instant it left the pulpit, the chapel changed. The heavy double doors behind me shuddered once, a single, breathless heartbeat, then slammed shut with a concussion that shook the whole building. Locks I'd never seen snapped into place, thick bolts driving into ancient stone with a grinding finality. The chandeliers overhead swayed, the light catching their cracked glass like 1,000 tiny eyes winking shut. Something stirred at the far end of the chapel. The shadows there deepened, thickened. I squinted into the gloom, heart screaming against my ribs. Movement, a flicker of it, slithered just out of reach of the candlelight. Low and fast, something slipping between pews, silent as breath. I turned fully, parchment still clutched in my hand. Nothing there. The pews stood as they had before, perfectly aligned, perfectly still. The hymnals untouched, the cushions faded and cracked. No footprints, no shifting steps, just the long, cavernous silence and the pulsing stink of copper that was somehow inside my mouth now, coating my tongue, sliding down my throat. I thought I caught the glint of wetness at the far wall, a dampness seeping from the cracks between the stones. Blinking hard, I shook my head. The parchment crinkled in my hand, brittle and sticky all at once. Above me, something creaked, the sound of old wood bending under a weight that shouldn't be there. I looked up, saw nothing but the ribbed ceiling lost in the dimness. Yet the feeling of being watch tightened around me like a noose. Something was very, very wrong. The floor beneath my boots was subtly different now. Less solid, I shifted my weight and felt a give, as if the wood was breathing under me, rising and falling in a slow, queasy rhythm. At the edge of my hearing, a low murmur began, words spoken too soft to understand, curling around the edges of the pews, threading through the air. It sounded like prayer, but not the kind I'd grown up hearing. A different kind, older. I backed away from the pulpit, each step feeling heavier than the last, like the chapel itself was trying to hold me in place. As I retreated, I glimpsed the pulpit again, the Bible still lying open. But now, the pages seemed different. New words had appeared, scrawled across the ancient paper in the same frantic hand as the sermon. The ink was still wet, dripping down onto the wood below. The words were simple. You have been heard. The candles lining the walls guttered, their flames bending sharply sideways, as if pulled by an invisible breath from deep within the earth. Somewhere behind the altar, something large shifted again, this time unmistakable. A scraping sound like something heavy dragging itself across stone. My vision narrowed, tunneling to a single point as the edges of the room blurred. The copper stink flooded my nose, drowning me. The second Mass had begun, and I was not alone. The chapel exhaled around me, a long, shuddering breath that carried with it the sour tang of something ancient. I stood trembling at the pulpit, the parchment still wilting in my hand, until my body remembered how to move again. The pews loomed ahead in stiff, perfect rows. Empty, silent, but every hair along my arms bristled as if each bench hid unseen eyes, watching from just beyond reach. I forced myself to move, each step a struggle through air, so thick it felt viscous. Dust blanketed the pews in heavy sheets, muting the once warm oak to the color of ash. I reached out, half expecting my fingers to pass through the scene like a dream. They didn't. When I brushed the nearest pew, a strange thing happened. The dust where I touched shifted, not merely away, as dust should when disturbed, but into the shape of a handprint. A perfect handprint, only not mine. It was smaller than my hand, slender, delicate, and tinted faintly red. Fresh, vibrant, like a smear of blood dragged across the wood. I recoiled as if stung, stumbling back into the aisle. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, almost loud enough to drown out the new sound rising around me. Whispers. They began low, uncertain like breath caught in a dying throat. Faint as mist, they slithered up from beneath the chapel floor. 100 voices, maybe more, murmuring in broken fragments of words, 1,000 desperate prayers melting together into a single, writhing sound. The floorboards trembled underfoot. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the rows of pews. Some of them bore subtle wounds, splits and hairline fractures running along the grain of the wood, almost as if something had pressed upward from below. Long cracks curled up the legs of the benches like vines reaching for air. I knew then that whatever had taken the congregation all those years ago hadn't simply arrived here. It had been invited, it had been waiting, and it was still hungry. The altar rose ahead of me, simple and plain, draped with a sagging cloth now rotted to gray tatters. Candles, half melted and dead, stood in cold brass holders. In front of the altar, a wide patch of carpet spread out, a darker shade, almost black, as if stained by things better left unspoken. Compelled by something deeper than curiosity, I approached. The whispers thickened, rising like steam from cracks between the floorboards, slipping into my ears, whispering promises I dared not understand. Every step closer to the altar felt heavier, as if invisible hands pressed down on my shoulders. Kneeling at the edge of the rug, I noticed the way it puckered in odd places, as if stretched too tightly across something misshapen underneath. I hesitated, but only for a breath. I reached out and peeled back the corner. Beneath the matted fabric, hidden in the bowels of the chapel for God knew how long, was a trapdoor. Its iron handle was corroded to near disintegration, and the edges of the hatch were lined with thick black nails, hammered deep into the wood like a crude seal. The boards around it were warped and swollen, as if soaked in something far worse than water. A smell coiled up from the seams, thick, fetid, a rot that spoke of things buried alive. I leaned closer, peering into the dim light. That's when I saw them, scratched along the perimeter of the trapdoor, gouged deep into the wood by frantic, unrelenting hands, were claw marks. Hundreds of them, tiny, overlapping. Some were little more than desperate scrapes. Others had dug so deep they splintered the wood, leaving behind jagged, gaping wounds. The marks radiated outward from the center of the trapdoor. From the inside, I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The thing below had not been locked away. It had been trying to get out. And still, somewhere beneath my horror, a deeper dread unfurled. Not at the idea that something had tried to escape, but at the knowledge that the chapel still stood. Silent, waiting, which meant whatever was down there had not succeeded. It was still there, still waiting, still listening. The whispers pressed closer now, shaping themselves into almost words, syllables that licked the edges of my mind like flames. The dust swirled in the stale air, spinning lazy circles above the cracked pews. I pressed my hand flat against the altar to steady myself and felt something wet under my palm. Drawing it back, I stared at the crimson smear across my skin, thin, watery, and still warm. The altar was bleeding. I backed away slowly, the walls of the chapel closing in, the whispers rising to a fevered, gibbering cacophony just below the threshold of hearing. Somewhere, unseen, I felt something shift. A dragging movement, slow and patient, far below my feet. The trapdoor at the altar's base shuddered, just once, so faintly it might have been my imagination. But I knew better. It was stirring. It had felt me. It was waking up. There are certain instincts baked into the bones of all living things. The primal knowledge that some doors were never meant to be opened, that some silences are not meant to be broken. Yet even knowing this, I moved. The iron ring of the trapdoor was corroded, the metal brittle under my grasp. Flakes of rust fell like red snow as I pulled. It protested at first, but the nails sealing it splintered with a soft, sickly crackle, as though the wood itself had been rotting from the inside out. The door groaned open, releasing a breath that had been trapped for decades. A stench poured out, thick, meaty, and wrong. It wasn't just the smell of rot. It was older than that, more elemental, like the stink of wet earth long after the grave had forgotten its dead. My stomach lurched, while rising into my throat. A narrow stairway spiraled down into darkness, so complete it seemed to eat the light around it. The edges of the opening looked wet, slick with some unnamed moisture that glistened in the faint glow of the chapel's remaining candles. I fumbled for the stub of a candle from a nearby holder. The wick hissed as it caught the flame, but what bloomed wasn't a steady yellow light. It was green, sickly and unnatural, casting the stairwell in a queasy pallor that made every crack and crevice look alive. The air grew heavier as I stepped through the trapdoor. It wrapped around me like damp fingers, pulling at my clothes, tugging at my skin. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to seal the hatch and run from that place forever. But something had been set into motion, some ancient inertia that would not let me go. I descended. Each step downward seemed to stretch longer than the last. The stone underfoot oozed moisture, the walls slick with it. They pulsed subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the slow contraction of a living throat swallowing me deeper into the earth. The candlelight shuddered in my hand, casting long, twisted shadows that danced ahead of me. The air vibrated with a sound so low it hovered just outside of hearing, a thrumming like the heartbeat of something vast and buried. Finally, the stairwell ended. The room it opened into was crude, roughly hewn from bedrock, with walls slick and breathing. The green candlelight revealed rows of crude pews lined up before a massive altar of raw stone. Everything about it was wrong. The proportions, the angles, it all bent subtly away for what the mind expected, creating a nauseating sense of vertigo that made my skin crawl. But it wasn't the architecture that stole the breath from my lungs. It was the figures. They sat in the pews, motionless, facing the altar in silent reverence. Their bodies were desiccated but intact, frozen in perfect attitudes of prayer. Their clothing was tattered, soaked into their bodies as if they had been buried in it. Their faces, dear God, their faces, mouths sewn shut with thick, blackened thread that pulled their lips into grotesque, mocking smiles. Their eyes, where eyes should have been, were sunken pits of slick blackness, no reflection, no light, only endless, hungry dark. Their hands clutched books to their chests. Not hymnals, not anything human. The books were bound in strange, fleshy material, scrawled with symbols that twisted and writhed if I tried to focus on them too long. Language without rules, letters formed from nightmare and ash. The candle flickered violently in my hand as I moved closer, as if it, too, fought against what it illuminated. I scanned their faces, willing myself not to scream. And then, impossibly, I recognized them. At first it was just one, the hunched figure in the second pew, a scarf still tangled around its rotted neck. The mayor, the same man who years ago had given interviews about surviving Father Holloway's final sermon. Further down, another, a woman with a locket still clutched between her stitched hands. The schoolteacher. Her face was unmistakable even through the horror. And there, 3 rows back, another. My blood froze solid in my veins. The twisted, sunken features of my own uncle stared back at me, locked in eternal worship. Memories crashed through me in flashes, him laughing at family dinners, the smell of his tobacco pipe, the reassuring weight of his hand on my shoulder as he told me, all those years ago, that sometimes people just see things when they're scared. But he hadn't survived. None of them had. They had merely changed. The survivors hadn't walked away from the massacre at the chapel. They had been claimed. The trapdoor above me groaned as if something heavy pressed against it. Dust rained down in fine, choking clouds. The figures remained still, but the air felt charged now, heavy with a new, eager tension, like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise. Somewhere beyond the altar, something else moved, slow and deliberate. The shadows recoiled from its shape, but I could feel it, vast, coiled like a fist ready to unspool itself. The second mass was not a thing of metaphors or superstition. It was real, and it was only just beginning. Panic tore through me in sharp, staggering waves. The greenish flame of the candle sputtered wildly in my hand, casting everything in frantic, twisting shadows. I turned back toward the stairs, desperate to claw my way out of that grotesque underworld. But where the stairwell had once been, there was now only a wall, endless, seamless stone, slick with pulsing moisture. No opening, no escape. The air thickened, clotting in my throat. Behind me, a noise scraped through the dark, a collective, shuddering creak, like wood bending under immense pressure. I spun around just in time to see the figures in the pews begin to move. They twitched first, little jerks of ruined limbs, spasms traveling through their bodies like aftershocks. Then with one sickening, unified motion, they rose. The dry crack of ancient tendons and the brittle pop of dislocated joints echoed in the stone chamber. Their heads turned toward me in perfect synchrony, the black pits where their eyes once lived locking onto my trembling form. The candle dropped from my numb fingers, the flame snuffing out before it hit the ground. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and absolute, but I could still hear them. The creaking shuffle of their feet dragging forward, the wet, rasping whisper of breath from lungs that should not have functioned. Above, from somewhere distant and unreachable, came a sudden blast of noise. A roaring, furious chant, spewed forth in 1,000 broken voices. The sermon parchment, the one I had lifted from the pulpit, had ignited. I could feel its fire through the stone itself, a heatless flame that spread like a living thing. The words of Father Holloway's final sermon boiled through the walls, not recited in holy reverence, but barked and shrieked in tones that twisted language into something monstrous. The chants rolled over me, filling the chamber like a rising tide. Their cadence was wrong, a mutilated echo of liturgy. The words wrapped around me, squeezing, pulling at the fibers of my mind. Each syllable carved away another sliver of reason, replacing it with something older, something hungrier. The figures shuffled closer, I staggered backward, hands blindly groping against the unbroken wall. The true horror finally bloomed in my mind, cold and complete. The first Mass, the one everyone whispered about, the one that had ended in blood and silence, had never been the tragedy the town believed it was. It had been an invitation, a calling, a gathering for the second Mass that had waited, patient and unseen, beneath the skin of the world. The congregation was not made of those who survived. The congregation was the survival. And now they wanted me. Invisible hands seized me from behind, ice cold and vice strong, yanking me off my feet. I struggled, kicked, fought against them, but they bore me forward inexorably toward the altar. My nails raked against the stone floor, leaving bloody trails that quickly vanished into the pulsing wetness. The altar loomed closer, massive and glistening with the condensation of the living rock. It pulsed with each beat of the unseen heart thudding deep below the world. The chanting built to a terrible crescendo, shaking the very air, rattling my bones inside my skin. The figures crowded closer, their sewn mouths grinning wide, their blackened hands outstretched in mockery of blessing. I was hoisted up, slammed down upon the altar's cold, oozing surface. My vision blurred, the edges of the world fuzzing and darkening. I expected death. I braced for it, but death did not come. Instead, something seeped into me. Not pain, not even cold. It was as if the stone beneath me breathed, exhaling a slow, suffocating mist that wrapped itself around my soul, cradling it, breaking it down, reforming it. Memories peeled away like dead skin. My body shuddered once, violently, then relaxed into a stillness that was not my own. The voices rose louder, so loud the sound seemed to tear through the fabric of reality itself, and then, without warning, fell into silence. A perfect, endless silence, except for one sound. A voice, my voice, rising into the void. I could feel it pouring out of my throat, a low, guttural chant in that same hideous language that squirmed and writhed like a living thing. The words tasted of dust and blood and ancient hunger. I no longer fought. I no longer feared. I understood now. This place had not needed a congregation alone. It needed a shepherd, someone to stand at the pulpit once again, someone to guide the second Mass, someone to replace Father Holloway. As the last shreds of my former self burned away in the green light of the second sermon, I felt my body rise from the altar, lifted by hands unseen. I was no longer a visitor in this place. I was part of it. I stepped down from the altar on legs that were both mine and not mine, the congregation bowing their twisted heads in reverence. The pulpit awaited me above, the chapel stirring with life once more. The new Mass had begun, and I was to lead it,